everybody. I'd like to get started. For those of you I don't know, there are probably a few. I've been speaking at the Director of the Poverty Institute. This is my last New Perspectives lecture series. The New Perspectives lecture series was initiated by then head Marie John during her tenure as the head of IRP, and it's a great tradition we have. So what have I done in terms of new traditions? Well, or new perspectives. Well, I guess the guy who did job training. We know about that. No, if you haven't been watching 60 Minutes lately, you haven't seen Gerard Chirtanian. And he was here a few years ago. We were lucky enough to get Assemblyman Anthony here 2 years before his stuff appeared in Science. Now, since this is my thing, it was my turn to pick next year, whoever the new director is, to pick whoever they want. One of the things that I wanted to do when I came, and we haven't done enough about, is particularly young men and particularly disadvantaged young men and minority men and their interaction with the criminal justice system. It's something that's understudied. We can't find them in our data quite often, and the effects are huge. So we have professors of political science here who have begun to notice what happens to voting in Americans who can't vote, and all sorts of things like that. So last year at our summer workshop, Chris came and gave a fantastic presentation. That's what I want. That's what I want. Yeah. I just filled him up with that. So anyway, let me just say a couple words about, on Monday we're co-sponsoring the seminar with the Center for Financial Security and the Thomas Foreclosing on the Neighborhood, Financial Market Structured Neighborhood Processes, which is another interesting neighborhood effect. Not crime, but also foreclosure and the way that the housing market is structured. And next Thursday, we're back in our regular building with Joe Glass, who's a professor of social work. He's a new affiliate. He's going to talk about poverty, racial and ethnic disparities, and the social consequences of alcohol use. So whether it's messing up, drinking, voting, this being in over your head in housing, the next week's devoted to the neighborhoods. So anyway, grab your food, you guys. It's okay. We ended up taking too much food home after the previous ones. As Leah Gerson, she just got a big fellowship for dissertation. Yeah, Leah. So now, let me introduce Chris Uggen. He is the distinguished professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota, where he's been since he got his PhD at some place called University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1995. He's a fine Norwegian American. That's why he's not Owen or something like that. I learned that the hard way. He's written far and wide, and is probably one of the most respected and broadest people who study criminology. I mean, everything from earnings, inequality, the neighborhood effects, the family effects. And what I asked him to do is just give us a big picture about all of the different ways in which the criminal justice system penalizes people long term. Now, this is not to say there aren't people out there who should be locked up. I should have been locked up more often, for instance. But it is to say that there can be some really bad social consequences, given that we have people who, have been given 3 terms and 30 years in jail for things that are legal now in half of the states, or close to it in half the states. So that's Chris. Now, to respond, of course, I had to find somebody, and I looked for a law enforcement type, but I couldn't find one. So instead, I got Mike Masolia. Mike, you can say that that your hat's purple, and he would say no, it's not purple, it's not even red, it's yellow. And that's his job here, is to disagree with Chris. So we're going to have about 45 minutes worth of presentation with Chris, then we're going to have 10 or 15 minutes of here's what I like and didn't like from Mike. And we'll all be done in time for the ball game tonight. So,
Thank you. This is a great thrill. I think I'll try to go without a microphone for a while. those of you who were born sometime after me won't recognize, this is a record. This is a phonograph record. The big picture issue that I really want to hit on today is that there's a huge gulf between the science in criminology and public perception and policy perception. And I would say the last generation of research has shown pretty clearly, longitudinally, that everybody desists from crime eventually. And I take that term from John Law, Rob Sampson. There are lots of shifts and transitions, but people move through the system. The policy, though, is kind of stuck in an area with the perception. There's two kinds of people in the world. There's the bad actors, there's the good citizens. We lock up the bad actors forever, the good citizens are safe. Now that we've had sort of this clash for several years, but one of the things that's also emerged in recent years is that the labels that are attaching to crime have become increasingly sticky. That is, they're attaching ever more firmly to individuals. I'll explain what I mean in a minute. So part of the problem, and I think the policy challenge, is to identify where there's excess punishment, where we're punishing more than perhaps we need to, and whether there might be less coercive solutions to the Hobbesian problem of order. So I'll say something about that. I'm also just back from Rwanda, where it's the 20th commemoration of the genocide. And I'd say it's a nation that has had to deal with reintegration, with massive amounts of prisoners returning to communities. And the challenge is, as Kim says, crime is real, crime has consequences. It's not that we want to minimize the costs of crime. I attended several memorials in which hundreds of thousands of people were buried. Rwanda, the display of the atrocities remains on full view, in public view, and so it's very much in your face. And went directly from a memorial to a reintegration camp, to essentially a step-down camp between the prison and the community, and met with 200 perpetrators who were on the way back to their communities, genocide perpetrators. And this has been going on a massive scale in Rwanda. It is going on on a much smaller scale in the United States, though, as prisoners return to their communities. And I'll talk about 8 related areas here. Some of them, really briefly. I wanted to set it up as this contrast between fluidity and stickiness. I had trouble illustrating this presentation because if you do a Google image search on these terms, make sure you have your safe search on, okay? Because it could be a little ugly. So I'll say something about what I mean by that, about the rise of the criminal class, a little bit of demography, the spillover effects on criminal justice populations, on politics, in particular politics in Wisconsin, and other outcomes, health and labor market I'll mention as well. Reintegrated versus stigmatizing approaches to justice, and then some reforms. So the first thing I want to point out is the familiar age crime curve. There's a well-established empirical regularity, whether you're looking at crime, whether you're looking at arrest, etc., that crime rises in the late teens, early 20s, it peaks, and then declines thereafter, regardless of pretty much which offense you're looking at. People think, oh, embezzlement, well, that must peak in the 40s or 50s. Not really. Most kind of fraud occurs far younger. So I notice I teach these graphs every year in my delinquency class, and I'm always a little bit disappointed. I don't know if it's a masculinity thing when I cross into another age group and I see I'm getting more and more harmless as I progress in the life course. So I'm staring down 50 this spring. So I'm thinking, boy, I'm completely harmless at that point. But so that looks nice and smooth. But the reality is, for the individual, at the individual level, there's all sorts of action in and out. And so here, I'm just going to show you very briefly 3 years from one former prisoner's life. This is we call Paul in Oakland. This is part of the National Supported Work Demonstration Project that Herb Piliavin and others at IRP studied for many years. but is a fairly typical set of experiences. In the first month, you can read across the top, these are the months and those are his activities. He was using cocaine. He was earning about $900 illegally that month. All an estimate, you know, these are self-reported data. He was living with a spouse. He had no job and he was incarcerated for at least a portion of the first 5 months. After that, he begins working in a program job. He's working in kind of a minimum wage job. So he picks up a little bit of earnings, about $400 a month. And he starts earning money illegally again, again estimating about $900. That escalates, you can see, up to over $3,000 once he starts picking up heroin use. And about that same time, he loses his spouse or partner, in this case a spouse. So this does not look like a good candidate for release or reintegration. The second year, kind of more of the same. We start out with high illegal earnings, heavy drug use, no more arrests coming on the timeline. There's some unearned income, some general assistance coming into his household, but really not much happening until the 18 months. He ceases drug use. And he does, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps this is pattern regularity, move in with his spouse again. Finally, at month 24, you see that little yes, he gets a job. Gets a job, and the third year, this is what the program's trying to accomplish. He's working steadily, he's in a stable relationship, he is no longer arrested, and he is essentially held down a job and held down family life and taken his role as an adult citizen in his community. So the trick is that we want to be punishing Paul during this period, but not during this period. Now, can institutions help ease this transition to adulthood, this transition to becoming an adult citizen? And I think this is an increasingly important policy issue, particularly in light of the demographic changes that I know I testify in Minnesota on these issues. We're rapidly aging as a state. We need the productive capacity of all citizens, and we certainly don't want to be paying $45,000 per year to lock up Paul or others when that's not needed. So I'm going to move a little more quickly just to make sure we leave some time at the end. That one of the challenges is I mentioned that records are increasingly sticky. What do I mean by the stickiness here? In Irving Goffman's terms, I would argue that recent cohorts of young people, especially young men, are discredited. They've gone from being discreditable in social interactions, from having kind of this secret that would damage them if it were known, to being formally discredited. And I can confess now, I have tenure that when I was a young man, I was arrested several times. I had done sleepovers in several different jails, and that it did not affect me at all in any way when I applied to the University of Minnesota as an undergraduate. It did not affect my job as a social worker. It did not affect, I worked for the Dane County Private Industry Council before graduate school. Certainly didn't affect my graduate school application, and it didn't affect me when I applied for a job at the University of Minnesota in 1995. Today, I'm not sure that's the case. There's been an explosion of records. First, Bobby Brame at the University of South Carolina has a nice study in pediatrics showing that about 30% of young people are arrested by the age of 23, 49% for African American males. Arrest is increasingly commonplace. That's just by age 23. There's about 14 million arrests in the United States per year. They often go no farther than arrest. They're often used just to simply clear a corner in an urban area with no intention to prosecute. But they do appear on a formal record. And there's been this explosion of access to these records. That's the thing. We did an audit study along the lines of Devo Pager's famous audit studies in Milwaukee and New York with Minnesota employers. 70% of our employers were routinely checking records, and these were for entry-level jobs in fast food, in retail, in everything that didn't require more than a high school diploma. 70% were checking, and almost all of them were using private search firms. So that means that it was just a couple keystrokes to get a full criminal record. And you know, this was always possible to do. The records have always been public for lots of reasons. But to investigate my record in 1995, you would have had to go to the county courthouse. You would have had to devote the better part of the afternoon to digging that up. You had to really want to get it. You had to have kind of a much more compelling reason rather than a quick search. So, as I say, there's been this explosion in access. We know that these records are very consequential for felony convictions, but misdemeanors are much more common. How common? Well, you can't talk about the subject without dealing with race. And I'm going to beat up on Minnesota for a while, and then I'll beat up on Wisconsin, and then you'll send me back to Minnesota.
So in Mississippi, try to beat up on that.
I could, but their numbers aren't as bad. So here's the annual arrest rate for by race. This is the annual arrest rate per 1,000, not per 100,000, but per 1,000 per year. So African Americans in Minnesota is 227 per 1,000 per year. It is very difficult to avoid arrest if you're an African American male in Minnesota. The imprisonment rate, about which so much has been mentioned, is only 13.7. Only, I say, in Minnesota. It's a lot. But you can see the disparities. American Indian is about 158. Whites and Asians about 30 per 1,000. Big disparities and a large magnitude in those effects. So what we did is we set up an audit study. I won't dwell too much on the record. But we recruited young men to apply for jobs and varied whether they had a 3-year-old disorderly conduct arrest. We tried to think of what the lowest level arrest might be. And you can think of things that might be a little less stigmatizing than disorderly conduct. I mean, what's a real trivial offense that you might think of?
Drunken disorder.
Drunken disorderly, that's good, but that touches the substance use. Many times.
Traffic violation.
What's that?
Traffic violation.
Traffic, good. Others, loitering, trespassing. We wanted to do loitering, but it turns out that in Minnesota we called that lurking. It's coded in. And that sounded kind of sinister. So we found big effects of lurking. I wouldn't be surprised, but I wouldn't know if it was a crime. So we had a 3-year-old disorderly conduct arrest, and we had African American and white testers. We rotated which of the testers had the record each week, and we sent them out to apply for jobs. We didn't find huge effects of the stigma. We did see a noticeable reduction in the callback rate, rate of positive responses from employers. That is, so about 39% of our white applicants with no arrest record got a positive callback from an employer, relative to 35% of those with records. You can see a big race difference, though. African Americans is about 28% and 24%. So even the low-level arrest, when we go to kind of the edge of stigma, we see some effect on some employer response. Now, this percentage point difference translates into a 15% drop for African Americans, 11% for whites. It's less often a disqualifying condition for African Americans or white applicants. But we also noticed a few things that mitigated the effect. The most powerful predictor was personal contact. If you're able to make personal contact with the employer, and we instructed our applicants to try to do that, to hand in your application to somebody who has authority over hiring, it dramatically reduces the stigma. It completely minimizes it. So if somebody who has a low-level record is able to hand in the job application, no effect. So we testified to this effect in Minnesota, And there's a change in the law, and we don't know whether it's going to make a difference. But here's what we did. So the employers have a legitimate interest and legitimate right to know something about those people they're hiring, but we wanted to avoid that initial screen. So as of January 1st, you can consider the criminal record, but only at the finalist stage. So only at the interview stage can you ask about the criminal record. Now, the first stage of the evaluation we're doing is we're actually going back to the places that we audited and collecting their applications to see if they changed the applications. Because if they didn't change the applications, it probably won't be in effect. But we also want to see whether this actually makes a difference. The other thing that mitigated the effect that I was talking with Jared this morning, briefly, didn't put on the slides, was that more diverse workplaces did not discriminate on the basis of a low-level record. Because those records are so ubiquitous within the hiring pool that they're drawing from, they're able to distinguish. Yes?
I'm just wondering how you can be sure that they're not looking at the records before the final stage, because I mean, you talked about how easy it is to look it up, and they just say,
Exactly. We don't know. We can't verify that, and we don't know how effective these laws. Because we do have laws that say you can't discriminate on the basis of race too, and it's possible there might still be some of that going on.
Yes. This idea of considering the records on the interview stage, is that for any level crime? Like, even if they've committed a very serious crime, do I not get to know until I've already brought them in and spend my time interviewing this person?
That's correct. There may be some exceptions carved out for particular occupations.
Crimes,
No, but I don't think for particular crimes. I mean, I think
it's for crime.
That's right. That's right. So there are some licensure requirements as well, that people are notified that they're not eligible for particular jobs if they have particular records. And it's the same with housing, et cetera. But the idea, though, was to get past this simple statistical discrimination at the outset where you're doing that first level screen. And employers actually thought, well, this would not be too burdensome to make the decision at the final stage. So we'll see how it works. I mean, as I said, it's too early to know. Okay, well, I'll go kind of quickly over the demographics here, but just to give you a sense for the magnitude and scale, the United States, I think is well known now, has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Here's a cartogram that sort of grows or shrinks landmass for the statistic, in this case, the incarceration rate. We've had an increase since 1980 to 2010. From somewhere under 2 million people on paper to over 7 million people. But you can see there's been a little bit of a drop-off here in recent years. Finally, and I think the Obama administration, for moving relatively slowly on criminal justice reform, will be remembered for actually kind of stemming the tide in the growth of incarceration. We've done a lot of demographic work to try to estimate the number of ex-felons in populations, in part because we're trying to predict their patterns of voting and other forms of civic and political participation. That we estimate the felon class at about 20 million people in the United States today. And that class of ex-felons is going to continue to grow even though for several years, even as the incarceration rates level off. What does it look like? Well, I want to give you just a quick glimpse of what the spatial and racial story is. Here's what things looked like in 1980. We can't go too far back prior to that because the probation and parole records get really, really low. But if we're just looking at felony level offenses, kind of serious crimes that can compromise your right to public assistance, that can compromise your right to work in many occupations, can affect your ability to vote. It was about 2% of the voting age population in 1980. And you can see very few states were over 3 or 4%. By 2010, it's up to 6.5% nationally of the voting age population. It is an ex-felon, so it has a felony conviction history, which again can prevent you from working in many types of jobs, etc. And you see some geographic patterning there, particularly in Florida, Georgia, etc., have a higher rate. African American felons have always been overrepresented in correctional populations, at least since 1860, when we've got good census data. So even in 1980, about 5.5% of the African American voting age population had a felony level record. And you can see a different kind of geographical concentration here: Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, all relatively high. By 2010, this is up to 18% of the African American population, and over 20% in many states. So there's been a dramatic expansion in kind of the class of individuals who are convicted felonies. And I draw your attention to this because it's not just an incarceration story. It's not just prison. That really we've embarked on what my colleague Michelle Phelps calls mass probation. So Minnesota has a much larger percentage of its correctional populations under supervision for probation. I think Minnesota is 49th in the nation in terms of incarceration rates, but 8th in terms of correctional supervision. That means relatively few people in prison beds, but we put people on probation often for very long times. I testified on behalf of a man who was serving a 10-year probation sentence. He voted after 9 years and 10 months. It was illegal for him to vote. So they were charging him with a new felony for illegal voting. 9 years and 10 months clean on probation. Just to give you an idea that probation often carries very significant civil disabilities and costs. So what are some of the spillovers? As I mentioned, I'll emphasize voting just because it's kind of a hot political issue right now. We estimate about 5.8 million disenfranchised felons in the United States nationally. It's been on the rise. Here's a cartogram showing the geographic distribution. This is a much more dramatic shift because each state has different laws. So Wisconsin, disenfranchised. People know who's disenfranchised in Wisconsin? Which kind of criminal record? If you're in prison, you can't vote. If you're on probation, you can't vote. And if you're on parole, you can't vote, or supervised release. In Florida, which is bloated, I'm not supposed to say engorged because that has a different connotation. But you can see Florida has over 1 million people who are disenfranchised by virtue of a felony conviction. Maine gets all skinny. Maine allows prisoners to vote, probationers and parolees, so they don't disenfranchise anyone. So you can see tremendous texture around the country in this. If you add it all up, though, only about 1/4 of those who can't vote are currently incarcerated. Even though it's a minority of states that disenfranchise for life, states like Florida, those numbers accumulate very rapidly because of that change over the life course. So that if you committed a crime in your teens or 20s, you could be in your 60s or 70s and still unable to vote. And as I say, probation is taking up a larger share of this group. In Wisconsin, the figure looks a little differently. I've only got through 2010 numbers here, but I do have a report on Wisconsin disenfranchisement if anyone's interested. There's about 80,000 people disenfranchised, and about 28% are currently incarcerated of that group. So we did a national public opinion poll. It's getting a little bit older now. We did a survey experiment just asking which classes should be allowed to vote. And it rather emboldened politicians on this issue to see that 80% favored restoring the right to vote once you've done your time, once you've completed your sentence, which is what Eric Holder has been arguing since February. He's made it really clear we shouldn't be disenfranchising for life, but also probation and parole. So both Minnesota and Wisconsin currently don't allow you to vote while you're under community supervision. The place where public support drops off is in the prison. That prison gate is sort of viewed as a barrier. So only 31% say prisoners should be able to vote. Well, here's the racial disparities in disenfranchisement. If you add that up for Wisconsin, and the data are a little hinky, but I think we've got a good got a good handle on this now. I say geeky only that racial categorization and ethnicity have not been consistently collected. I know Pam Oliver's done some terrific work on that in this state. But about 10% of the, as near as we can tell, the African American population in Wisconsin is disenfranchised by virtue of felony conviction. And as I said, the most, at least half of that group, is in the community, is not locked up in bars. Relative to about 1% of whites and less than 1% of Asian Americans. And then, as in Minnesota, about 4% American Indian. And you can see the Hispanic versus non-Hispanic differential there as well. So a year or two ago, I was approached to kind of model what would happen if Wisconsin moved to re-enfranchising probationers and parolees. And so the green line suggests under that proposal, it would reduce the rate of disenfranchisement. It wouldn't reduce the disparities, but it would indeed reduce the rate of vote dilution among communities of color. That I would say that Wisconsin has an unusual rate of racial disparity relative to the rest of the nation. So it's about overall about 10 to 1 ratio of African Americans white disenfranchised across all of those populations, and then less so with only about 4 to 1 for felony probation. Okay, let's move to changing some of these trajectories. So what might be done? As I said, there's we have lots of effects, lots of spillover effects. What are some of the options that might be used? Well, one of them is the old employment, the old employment program. So supported employment, giving people jobs when they leave prison. In this case, leaving drug treatment. And again, I'll go back in part to supported work because we haven't had some very good randomized trials in recent years. This is a survival distribution of the control group who didn't get jobs, how long they lasted without getting arrested. And these are people leaving drug treatment, often with a history of cocaine and heroin use. That we did indeed see a treatment and control differential. Treatment group was indeed survived longer. That 74 in the treatment group means that 74% of those who were offered jobs had not yet been arrested after 18 months of the program, relative to 68% of those in the control group. We thought, well, let's not just look at arrests, let's look at robbery and burglary arrests, something that was more predatory economic crimes, crimes of greater concern to communities. And here too, we see a significant treatment control differential. That is, that the jobs are actually helping people avoid recidivism. And so one of the questions, I know it's a central concern of IRP, is how do social programs get counted as successes or failures? This one, you'll see this often written about with the failed social programs of the 1970s, that this didn't work. And I said, well, for a criminologist to get a 46% reduction in robbery and burglary with a randomized design, that should be news. Right? So, though some of you know the answer to this, why it was classified as a failure, but I think it brings up an important policy point. The program did not reduce drug use, did not reduce heroin use or cocaine use or other forms of drug use. So we had no effect. It did not lead to abstinence. It did not catapult people into middle class, kind of an idealized middle class life. But it did reduce robbery and burglary. And so one of the policy questions that's swirling around nationally in Minnesota and in Wisconsin is whether to insist on abstinence only in post-release programming. So there are many places that are experimenting with wet houses where you won't get kicked out if you're drinking, for example, in halfway houses. We explore this issue a bit more qualitatively and don't attempt to resolve it, but simply to say if we're interested in crime, we do have a technology that can help reduce crime at this stage. Okay, so that's a potentially important piece of the puzzle. Some things we do, though, are really designed to push people farther out, and I consider kind of piling on or stigmatizing sanctions. And I say the welfare ban on felony drug offenses likely had some pretty strong negative effects. Welfare reform has had many good and bad effects since 1996, but targeting drug-involved women may have led to increased crime through both motivation and control mechanisms. Here's what happened. The vertical bar represents the period of welfare reform, and then the line represents states that either opted out of the ban or imposed the ban. And essentially, across all types of crime, you see that the states imposing the ban did indeed have more female arrests, with the exception of one type of crime, which you could probably guess what it is. Drug arrests. So it didn't affect drug arrests, but it did affect many others. So I want to move on, just to leave a little bit of time to talk about the Wanda project, because it's a very different and abrupt shift. But after studying American criminal justice for 20 years, you have the sense that you're studying an outlier in many respects. So it can be instructive to look across nationally as well as across the states. I'll just give you a very brief introduction. There were over a million killed in the 1994 genocide. They kicked off April 6th when the president's plane went down. And as a criminologist, I'm especially interested in what steps were taken when we had no choice but to reintegrate. We had no choice but to restore. There were 6.5 million people in the nation, 1 million were dead, and you had 2 million perpetrators. So you can't write them off. And I think the United States, in many ways, is getting to a tipping point at which we can't write off everybody who's convicted of a felony. The legal structure was decimated. There were maybe 150 lawyers left after the genocide nationally. So they went to a hybrid system of community-based courts, traditional restorative courts, and with some centralized state reporting. So you'd elect trusted individuals within your community and hold informational hearings and then pass judgments. So we wanted to know whether genocide looked at all like crime, and what and how this kind of miracle of social organization, where they could actually get through 2 million cases, occurred. So we gathered data from 10,000 gacaca courts. We were there in the archives. There were 19,000 bankers' boxes full of material in enormous buildings, stacked floor to ceiling, not climate controlled. And so part of the project is going to be about facilitating getting all that stuff scanned. 60,000 were accused of planning the genocide, or were convicted of planning the genocide. 600,000 killing, and 1.3 million property offenders. Again, all in a very small nation. Well, there is an age genocide curve, we discovered. And it's much more symmetrical than the age crime curve that I showed you earlier. And the peak is a little bit later, as genocide scholars suggested. But you do see, it does follow, whether it's regard to looting, to murder, or planning the genocide. There's a consistent pattern there. And the gender distribution is quite similar to other forms of crime, to burglary, to homicide, etc. What kind of sanctions do you do when you can't afford to put everybody in prison? I visited a prison that had a capacity of 2,500 that in 1995-96, they estimate they had 60,000 inmates in it. So that puts our overcrowding problems in some perspective. For these sanctions, they made heavy use of fines. Heavy use, and there was some sense of satisfaction with this, except for the fact that there wasn't a mechanism for payment or for enforcement if you did not, if the fines were paid. So some of the survivors who thought there was great procedural justice were disappointed in the level of compensation. But then also negotiated agreements between families and perpetrators, exemptions in cases of indigence, that the perpetrator could ask forgiveness, could be exempted from fines, and then restitution, where you could return or pay back the goods that were taken, and those might be cows, they might be 2 doors of heavy wood, they might be any number of things. Now we do some of this in the United States. We do some of this with juvenile offenders, and particularly for very low-level stuff, for breaking windows. We haven't thought to try it at all in community courts with more serious offenses. They did use quite a bit of coercion as well. Severity graded punishments for planning and for killing, but often on a level that would be shorter sentences than one would obtain in the United States for killing. And for looting, it was only fines in this TIG camps where people would be building schools, building houses for the survivors. So there's great differences. Whether people are more or less culpable for genocide than other forms of killing. But I draw attention to Gacaca as a potential model for transitional justice, but also as a thought experiment for other forms of restorative sanctioning. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda has now netted 70 convictions and spent over $1 billion to do that. The whole Gacaca process got about 2 million convictions and spent about 400 million to do that in this radically decentralized system. So, as they say, and they actually got through all of those cases. It's been 20 years, but that's an impressive achievement. What about more modest reforms? Well, with work, 10 states and 52 cities now ban the box, which means you don't ask about the felony conviction on the job application. They say we're going to check that. We're gathering job applications right now. With regard to health, I didn't mention our health project too much. Since Mike's here and we're working together on it, I don't want him critiquing himself. That's terrible. But we expect to see a greater continuity of care with the Affordable Care Act, although somewhat cautiously optimistic there. With regard to welfare, more states are opting out of these very restrictive bans on public assistance. And with voting, there's been a lot of action. There's been now 24 states have expanded voting rights to over 1 million people. And those are pretty conservative estimates in the last 15 years or so. So let me wrap up. Just to say in big picture that I think the 2 kinds of people in the world argument is untenable. There's too much change, and there's a lot of excess punishment in the system. It's very difficult statistically, methodologically, to figure out who is being punished needlessly. How many people in prison need to be in prison? We won't minimize that task, but except to say that we likely are over-punishing. And I would say also that among criminologists, when I started as a graduate student in Wisconsin, that a lot of the task was about identifying who the offenders were. And that's really changed. Like, that's not what criminologists do anymore. It's really, and maybe you'll agree with this, but it's more about how do you affect transitions out of crime, and what accounts for transitions into crime. So there's a number of approaches to reform. And I go back to Hobbes. We can coerce people through the terror of some punishment. We can create a more credible societal promise that being good will result in doing well, the exchange solution, Herbert Spencer. Or we can make a normative appeal to common values, that is, to stand shoulder to shoulder with your fellow citizens And that's clearly what is happening in Rwanda. There's a One Rwanda move that is really anti-genocide and anti-hate. So I say, this is a point at which I'm sometimes accused of being a Pollyanna. And say, is it possible to ramp down mass incarceration while keeping a lid on crime rates? We have enjoyed a significant crime drop in this nation, a drop of about 50% in the last 20 years. So can we do it? Well, and just as one last picture, here's the United States, the incarceration rate in blue. This is state prison incarceration rate, I don't have jail in there. And there's the Rwandan incarceration rate. And you might have read, I don't know if you saw the Times piece, I think Tim and I were talking about it today. This is one of the more vibrant economies, certainly in Africa, perhaps in the world, that's been able to reabsorb and reintegrate a massive number of returning prisoners. So thank you.
This is our Mike, he's Associate Professor of Sociology and a fellow criminologist. And Mike, tell us what he thinks about it. Well, you got PowerPoint, everything?
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm going to make you look bad. So as way of background, a handful of you know, but most of you don't, Chris was my PhD advisor. And so on the one hand, when Tim was like, hey, would you like to comment on this guy's stuff? I'm like, absolutely. I've been waiting 7 years. But on the other hand, when I got to Minnesota, I knew nothing. And all of my limited successes are directly tied to what Chris taught me and the time he spent with me. And I am just eternally grateful that I got lucky enough to meet Chris. So, so I don't have too much negative to say about Chris, not you, my neighbor, for that matter. But I do have something to think a little bit about. So when we're thinking about policy and we're thinking about what's happened to research in this area, there has been just a tremendous expansion of research broadly in the areas that Chris was talking about, from arrest to conviction to post-conviction to incarceration. And early on, that research was fairly straightforward. It looked at jobs, it looked at poverty, it looked at income. And as the area has expanded, the breadth of things being studied has just expanded exponentially. Debt, voting, health, adult mortality, infant mortality, behavior of children, parenting styles. And what I think is really important as we move to what I would really think about as the sort of the next stage of incarceration research, and research on this topic more broadly, is moving beyond just documenting patterns. Because when we're thinking about policies and policy recommendations, it's important to understand things like mechanisms. It's important to understand things like causal effects. It's important to understand what the treatment really is. And oftentimes, both in some of Chris's work and my work and in the field more generally, there's often some fuzziness around these issues of methodology and these issues of what the mechanisms are and what the treatments really are. And when you think about the expansion of the penal system broadly, it encompasses so much. Arrest rates, you can be arrested and go to jail without ever having been convicted of anything. You can have a criminal conviction that can be a felony or a misdemeanor. So you can have an arrest record, you can have a jail record, and you can have no conviction at all. Or you can have an arrest record, a jail record, and be convicted of a felony. And if you're convicted of a felony, post-felony, you can be on probation, you can be in jail, you can be on prison. So what is the real treatment that we're studying? And it varies with multiple studies. Are we studying the consequences of arrest? Are we studying the consequences, Chris, of a felony conviction? Are we studying the consequences of being incarcerated? And when you think about it like that, when you think about policy recommendations, the treatment, for lack of a better word, is fundamentally important. And most of the research, or some of the research, sweeps all of this sort of contact with the justice system together, when really, if you're thinking about policy, it's multiple different things that are going on. Second, I talk a little bit about sort of causal effects. And we start with the basic premise that felons are different than non-felons. Right? In some ways, it's pretty easy to measure, education levels or income levels. In other ways, it's quite hard. What if somebody have a propensity to commit a crime? What about, there's the different work ethics? There's the differences in how people make decisions. And can we measure those things well? Because this is an area that's ripe for policy, but the policy has to be right. And the data issues complement the sort of the measurement issues. So, it's a challenging population to study. It's a very transient population. They're often missed in many household-based surveys. And moreover, we often learn about the population when they come to prison. It's very hard to have longitudinal data. We can't say, look, you're going to prison in 5 years, so I want to start collecting all this data on you today. And so the question is, and moreover, one of the things that Chris loves experiments, right? And so we can't randomize arrest. We can't randomize felony conviction.
I've tried, the judges won't go.
Right? Incredibly helpful to just take a subsection of the population for causal effects and sort of push them into prison, randomize prison. That won't go over well. So the question becomes, how confident are we in the effects? And not just how confident are we, if I said, I would say with absolute certainty, the average effect of incarceration on health is bad, right? It's negative. And I would say that, but if you said how bad, how specific, that's when it really becomes a policy question when we think about specific policy initiatives. And so I asked, one of the things Chris maybe talk a little bit about is what's the best approach, and I'm going to say taking out fixed effects models, right? So, one of the best ways is to study individual change with longitudinal data, but if we don't have longitudinal data and we can't randomize, then the question becomes how confident are we, not just in the direction of the significance, but the magnitude. Because when we're thinking about magnitude, when we're thinking about policy, I think magnitude is really important. And then, perhaps the area where Chris and I have disagreed the longest is some of the mechanisms, right? Stigma is commonly used explanation for a range of outcomes, but I would argue that the empirical support is much less clear. Stigma is often inferred from outcomes. Well, they don't hire as many ex-inmates, so it must be stigma, right? They don't hire as many people who've been arrested, so it must be stigma. And the other reason I think stigma is so popular is it resonates well with commonly held perceptions. It resonates with how we think about things. If I had to walk over to South Hall and explain my bout of incarceration to Maria, I would feel very stigmatized. But is that the same way that people with incarceration rates and 20% of the population, 30% of the population, 40% of the population being arrested? Is stigma the same way in all different communities? You could argue that it's a rational decision made by employers, that their contact with the criminal justice system is a signal about some aspect of employment that might be wise for employers to consider. So how do we know how do we understand the mechanisms? What is the evidence of things like stigma? And when I think about sort of and by the Chris sent 72 slides, so I wanted to keep it quick so that we had more time for Chris to talk and comments and so forth. But when we think about policies, it's important to understand what the treatment is, because if the treatment is incarceration, then policy should focus on reentry, focus on family relationships, focus on perhaps building job skills while people are in prison. If the treatment is arrest, if it's the arrest that's really driving the policy, we might want to think about cleaning records or diversion programs, radical non-intervention. That's how we talked about decades and decades ago. If the mechanism is stigma, we want some public education, some public awareness. We want people to know felons, right? We want people to understand why someone was in prison. Because one of the ways stigma festers very well is when you have lack of information. You impute what you don't know. They must be a serious felon. They must have been, every felon is a violent offender if you don't know them, right? It's the commonly held perception. So if it really is stigma, then we need public education and public awareness. If it's a rational employer who's making decisions, then we need tax credits, or we need some financial incentive to motivate employees to take chances on people who might otherwise be risky employees. And so I guess I just pushed Chris a little bit to think about sort of how sure we are of the mechanisms and how sure we are of the causal estimates that we have in the models, in the field more generally, not your work specifically, because it's just spectacular, right? And so with that, I maybe toss it back to Chris, and if you have any comments, and then
Wow, that was good. Big, wide world. I get to ask the first question. I've been thinking lately a lot about, I think about intergenerational mobility, and I think about the advantages at the top. And I think about, I had a plain conversation with Sarah McClanahan about the glass floor. And the glass floor, you won't let your kids slip for this or that reason. But I think a big part of the glass floor that I wish someone would do some work on is what happens when Mike or Tim because the kid gets arrested or gets in trouble. You got the best lawyer in town down there. You got him pulled out. You got him cleaned up. You've expunged it from the record. You made sure that nothing, nothing sticks. I mean, I think there's a huge difference in the way that people can give second chances to their children, and that varies tremendously. Is anybody doing any of this?
It's a fascinating issue. The one where the class perpetuates itself there is expungement. That you can afford, it's not cheap to have your record expunged, but if and Tim, I believe your child is 3 years old, so this has got a few
One of them.
One of them. But that is we're currently investigating the effects of expungement on future occupation, employment, and earnings. But I would say, it's clear that wealthier families have that capacity. The biggest effect that has been studied is just the effect of having two parents standing behind the child in juvenile court. There's a world of difference in sentencing. Not in guilt or innocence so much, right? But in terms of where you're going to go. And if you can afford to send your child to treatment, so kind of a famous case in Texas, a young man got off pretty lightly, then that is viewed as a viable option. And the juvenile justice system says, well, we use the bed space for people who need it. So I would say as sort of an engine of inequality, that the criminal justice system and juvenile justice can step up those existing inequalities and exaggerate them. It does have the capacity, though, to reduce inequalities as well. If we do education right, if we do public health right, that some of the work Mike and I are finding is that some of the health initiatives within prisons actually improve over the baseline community health in very disadvantaged communities. That says more about the baseline than about the prisons. But I'd say I do think that perpetuation of advantage is a real understudy area. It's a great point. Great dissertation.
So this notion of sticky public labels is very intriguing to me. Disclaimer, I do have a disorderly conduct conviction. The Wisconsin State Legislature just had a bill come before it this session. It died, it didn't come out of the Assembly. But the focus was on having non-guilty records removed from CCAP. So even to the degree that people might differ on what should happen with records of conviction, it seems to me that when you look at all the various reasons why someone might end up not guilty, from what you were saying about arrests being used just to clear a corner, or deliberate overcharging, all sorts of things come into play.
Right.
One of the arguments against that bill was that there was no proof that there actually is any stigma. Are you aware of any research that would focus on those people who are adjudicated not guilty or their cases are dismissed, and yet a record is maintained out in the system? Because my sort of intuitive feeling on this is that when someone's CCAP, those employers aren't making the distinction.
No.
They're just seeing records. And the common public belief is, well, if you weren't doing anything wrong, you wouldn't have been charged in the first place.
That's right. I would agree with that. I would say that the records are much scarier on paper, especially if you don't know how to read them. That the same event can trigger 4 or 5 listings, 4 or 5 charges. And so a man drinking alcohol in the park can be cited for disorderly loitering, public intoxication, all of these things that will show up.
Well, my disorderly conduct originally started as a felony charge, and it was reduced all the way down to an ordinance violation, because when they arrested me, they wanted to send a public signal to anybody who read that newspaper article.
Yeah. Well, and I would say that, so one of the things I've argued for has been a presumption of innocence and then an arrest that does not lead to prosecution should not be included in these repositories. The folks who've been most resistant to that have been the constitutional lawyers across the mall. Not any easy.
And journalists too.
And journalists, and it's viewed as the public nature of arrest is viewed as a vital protection against tyranny. And so I would say Democrats, Republicans, that has been, and in fact in these hearings in which people kind of came up with this idea to look at the records at the finalist stage, that was the argument used for not removing arrest records. But I do think that's the, I always dwell on the racial disparities here, because as universities are doing this, my University of Minnesota, we're going to now be checking arrests on all employees, and we don't quite know how the policy is going to shake out, but that is going to have a profound effect on the diversity of the workforce that we're able to hire if we start disqualifying people on the basis of low-level records. It has nothing to do with crime, it has everything to do with the geography of police patrol.
Yeah, right. So policing has changed fantastically, much more targeted, and since you're on the topic, is that particularly why Wisconsin, Minnesota, where minorities, in particular African-American minorities, were a small proportion, tend to live together, easily targeted? I know there's evidence in Syracuse that they're disproportionately arrested. Good statistical evidence. One of my students won an award for doing this study. Is that why we're,
Well, I mean, one of the answers to this, I think, is that we have very low white rates of punishment. Not quite as low as, say, European rates, but not that far off. And so that so I gave a similar presentation in South Carolina last week. Racial disparity is much more equal there than it is there's far less racial disparity there, but they have much higher rates of white punishment. Right? So it is a
what's more
yeah, but I would say that some of the recent legal changes. So if you move to felony DWI, the prison population gets much wider. Right? There is if you move to
we don't do drinking and disorderly arrests in Wisconsin. It's against
the ethos.
Unfortunately, but Eric.
We're looking a lot at arrests and convictions, right, in these data. And I will out myself as never being arrested, so I'm sorry. So
Upper class East Side guy.
I didn't say I got out of it. I said I wasn't arrested. So the question is, if we look at victimization records instead, and I'm sort of thinking of home here, like Wisconsin versus South Carolina. Are the differences in the ratios of blacks and white victimization totally out of whack with the arrest and conviction, or are they more similar?
It's a good question, Mike. Do you?
It depends a little bit on the crime, right?
Yeah.
And it depends where the victimization survey is done. Like household victimization surveys have different results than victimization reports on, general, social science surveys. So it varies a little bit by the mode of collection oftentimes.
But there is some. I mean, you've got me thinking about research right now, because there are data in the NCBS about perceived race of offender. And there's a lot of missing data because there's a lot of things missing. And so I can't honestly answer what those disparities look like. But I do think to some degree there's, what some of the qualitative research says, that in many ways low-income communities of color are over-policed and they're under-policed in different ways. So victims don't get the help they need in mobilizing their complaints often, but they are arrested at high rates. So I think I also think that that there is a class gradient here that states that have higher poverty populations, you do see higher rates of white arrest and conviction, and for part of the privilege reasons that Tim
One
said.
could be causing the other too.
Right.
I mean, higher arrest rates mean less earnings mean more.
That's right.
Catherine.
So, I was wondering if you thought that a proper avenue for reform would be through the juvenile court system. I know that in some recent years they've been moving more towards deferred adjudication for first-time juvenile offenders, and if maybe that was pursued, you know, more aggressively, if that would have a bigger effect, or if you've been able to study that at all. I imagine you have selection to finding out if someone had deferred adjudication in their record.
Yeah, I do think that's a good avenue, and part of what I'm arguing for, especially with these low-level offenses, is and kind of made the argument to get the garbage cases out of the system. So if a merchant complains, you know, and that there's a bunch of guys hanging out in front of their shop, and they want to move along, we don't need to create an arrest record for that. So that's one avenue, but deferring the prosecution, it would be conditional on some kind of, you know, staying out of trouble for the next amount of time. That's also a viable avenue. I will say though that, you know, right now we're having trouble. Even juvenile records have historically been sealed. The private search firms are now harvesting those records and making them available in many states. So Minnesota, for example, juvenile records are now appearing in these databases, where historically, you know, for 100 years the juvenile court always tried to avoid that. So even that those labels are getting stickier. But I think not just in the juvenile system, but deferred adjudication and more liberal use of expungement could make a real difference. The problem is once those records are created, it's very difficult to regulate. So once it goes in, it's hard to get it off. You can get it off the state registry, but not, you know, if Mike has a company in his basement where he's selling these records, it's tricky. And I do have to mention just really briefly a particularly odious industry that's arisen on mugshots, where there's internet firms that will put up your mugshot and then take it down for $250. So they'll put it up, and it'll be the first thing that somebody will get when they search your name. It'll be your mugshot. And you'll pay your $250, but there's 40 other companies that have done it too, and you have to pay them as well. So we've got a graduate student looking at this as well. So it solves some of the issues, but it's just part of the modern flow of communications today. It's going to be tricky.
I don't know if your junk emails like mine, but just this past week, maybe because I've been thinking about your talk,
Yeah.
I'm getting tons of spam mails about, do you know who lives next door? Or do you really want to hire this person, whatever, which makes me the price is really low when they're dealing with just essentially with volume. And so I remember when Finest Walsh and Unicon used to give you this information for $29. You get a red, yellow, or green light for a record. Now the price must be so low.
Yeah, you get a contract and then you can search anything. So you just sign up as a subscriber, and then you can
Yeah, like Intelli is $10 a month and you get unlimited searches.
Karen.
I have a question about the families of
Yes.
the incarcerated. You know, what effect does contact with families, contact with children have on their recidivism and have on the families and the children?
Yeah, well, this is a real hot button policy issue, and there was a White House conference in August that I attended on children of incarcerated parents that places not so much the effects on recidivism, but the effects on the children, that incarceration has now shown very strong effects on internalizing disorders, externalizing disorders, health problems, and it does, some of the research suffers from some of the issues that Mike talked about with mechanisms, but the mechanisms seem to be social isolation, rapid moves, that instability in terms of residency, and economic deprivation. So that the children affect, the effects on adults, it's very difficult. This is one, maybe we could randomly assign marriage, but we do see pretty strong correlations between having these stable relationships and desistance from crime. It's not, the cause and pathways are a little tougher to measure. I think Mike and colleagues have done some of the best work on
Well, I mean, the other thing I would add about the effects on children is it's important to try to understand how the effect of incarceration, if there is an effect of incarceration, is different than the effect of a father not being there, or a divorce, or loss of a father,
It's a counterfactual.
or any other mechanisms by which a father is removed that might produce some of the same results.
Yes, sir.
I was curious, your last slide really intrigued me about, policymakers and how are they going to do this. So has any of this research kind of been summed up in a way that if you're a policymaker and you've got money to spend, is there a multiplier on spending on police enforcement versus jail versus subsidizing someone who's out of jail, that you can hire them with tax credits or something like that? Like, what is the best multiplier? Is there a negative return on spending more money on police versus a positive return on tax credits?
Where should you spend the next dollar?
Exactly. Yeah, if you're a policymaker, how do you interpret this?
So what I would do is point to the guy who was at the White House with a policy forum on topics like this and say, no.
Well, yeah, I will say that the econometric research in particular is pointing to putting the dollars into law enforcement rather than prisons in terms of bang for the buck and crime reduction. Dan Hagan and others have really, I think, made a pretty convincing case for that. I think there's a bit more of a social welfare solution as well, and part of it has to be, as everyone here knows, it's not just about having trained workers; it's having an economy that can absorb the labor of folks. And so, for example, the pathway out of kind of intensive gang involvement had historically been a decent paying blue collar job that didn't require a whole bunch of education. And those are in short supply more generally. And so we're seeing kind of people lingering in gangs longer than they did a generation ago. Now, so working on that demand side makes sense as well. But I do think there are ways to, I point out the work, the work mechanism. I think there are ways to provide some support that don't compromise public safety. In particular, some of the reintegrative efforts, even things like allowing people to vote, does create a bond with a society that is certainly correlated with desistance from crime. So there are some policy levers.
The thing I would add about sort of Chris's point about the emphasis on law enforcement, once you get to prison, some of the research, the most optimistic research suggests that specific deficit reduction, specific job training might be more effective than a GED, or a specific tool that you can take into the labor market might be more effective than just a general,
If you had a buy-in from the employer, I would bet. I would love to see an audit study that took place over the last 5 or 6 years. But I think about shooting theory. I think about all the people with higher degrees who are working in jobs that don't require them. And go on down the line and look at this excess supply of labor. My guess is the easiest thing to sort out, the cheapest thing to sort out now is formally incarcerated. Just throw them out. Just, they're out of the pool.
Well, we do have what we call felon-friendly employers, and they're not very public about it. I was very, Target Corporation, for example, it was not a felon who took all this credit card information. And I go back to in my job here many years ago, Bach water heater. I don't think they're still around, but they were known as a place that would hire somebody with a record, and those guys would work like hell. They were over on the east side, and they provided pretty low-level wages but health insurance, and they had a very loyal and hard-working workforce. But again, you don't advertise that, in your institutional advertising. But I think if you are, you can kind of capitalize on. It's a little bit like playing Moneyball, right? You have an undervalued asset, and that if you do
Riskier, but
that's right.
pay off much.
That's right.
Any one last question? Well, I want to thank the both of you for this, I think, my best.
Ooh.
Last and best.